The power of silence, of presence, was enough. Kraus gestured again, and the agent from the jet bridge returned with a freshly printed boarding pass. Seat 1A. "You'll be flying up front, Major Brennan, with our full apologies and respect," Kraus said. "And let me be very clear. We will hold the plane as long as needed to ensure you are boarded properly and personally." Someone in the crowd clapped softly. Then another joined. A ripple of applause spread across the gate area, awkward at first, then sincere. Not for drama, not for performance, for recognition. George took the boarding pass with steady hands. "Thank you," he said simply. Kraus nodded again. "Your entire trip, this one and any future with us, is complimentary. But more than that, we're implementing changes effective immediately, starting today." Behind him, Tina was being quietly pulled aside by another official. Mark, the younger agent, looked on with visible discomfort, but relief too, like the moment a wrong he couldn't fix was finally being addressed. George glanced toward the window where the plane waited, the early morning sun glinting off its nose. For the first time that day, the burden in his chest lifted, not because he was going to fly first class, but because someone had stepped forward. Not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. In 8 minutes, a man who had been forgotten became visible again, and the nation, or at least one airline, remembered what honor was supposed to look like. As the buzz of the flashpoint settled into stunned quiet, George remained calm, quietly absorbing the sudden shift in atmosphere. A few steps away, the flight crew had formed a small huddle, receiving direct orders from the airline's vice president of operations who had just arrived, breathless and tight-lipped. Kraus, now composed but still visibly rattled, turned back to George with a firmness in his voice. "We're not just fixing this moment, sir. We're making sure this never happens again." He gestured to one of his assistants, who was already drafting internal messages on a tablet. "Effective immediately, a new high-priority veteran protocol is being established. Medal of Honor recipients, active duty, and distinguished veterans will have an automatic escalation process. No exceptions, no excuses." Meanwhile, the gate's energy continued to shift. Tina had been quietly relieved of her duties and was now standing off to the side with her supervisor, engaged in a tense, hushed conversation. Mark, still at the podium, was assisting a mother with 2 small children, his hands steady, but his eyes flickering back to the scene unfolding nearby. The moment wasn't just about George anymore. It had become something larger, a symbolic correction that others around them could feel. Kraus personally walked George down the jet bridge, flanked by 2 team members who cleared the path. As George boarded, the first-class cabin seemed to pause. A flight attendant offered a hand to help him settle into 1A, and the passenger originally assigned that seat, an executive in a sharp gray suit, had volunteered to switch without hesitation, standing now in the galley with a quiet smile and a nod. Back at the gate, boarding resumed, but the murmurs hadn't stopped. Passengers recounted what they'd witnessed in hushed tones, many already composing social media posts, some showing videos to others in line. The story was no longer just a customer service error. It was a narrative of humility meeting dignity, and dignity finally receiving its due. George leaned back into his seat as the door closed and the plane pushed from the gate. He didn't seek the applause nor the attention. What mattered to him was that a system, cold, indifferent, had cracked open just long enough to do what was right. And that, more than any upgrade or headline, was the part he'd remember. By the time Flight 227 touched down at Dulles, the story had already taken off. Videos captured at Gate D27 were spreading fast. Clips of the CEO rushing through the terminal, the ripple of applause, and a stoic older man in a weathered army coat being escorted onto the plane. By mid-afternoon, news outlets had picked it up, headlines reading, "Airline CEO intervenes after Medal of Honor, recipient downgraded." The footage showed George Brennan calmly accepting his restored seat, never raising his voice, never demanding attention, just quietly dignified. That calmness, juxtaposed with the corporate scramble to correct the mistake, struck a nerve. Social media flooded with comments like, "This is how you fix a wrong," and "Every veteran deserves this level of respect." Continental Skylines issued an official statement, signed personally by Martin Kraus, apologizing for the inexcusable breakdown in protocol and announcing the immediate rollout of a new initiative, the Brennan Priority. The policy would ensure any veteran holding distinguished service honors would be granted automatic travel accommodations and personal oversight throughout their journey. George, unaware of the media storm, was helped into a waiting vehicle arranged by the airline and taken straight to his hotel. He hadn't expected fanfare, and he didn't ask for it. What mattered to him wasn't the trending headlines or the corporate scramble. It was that someone had listened, that decency had stepped in, and that, for once, a quiet voice hadn't been ignored. In a world that often forgets its heroes until Memorial Day, George Brennan had reminded America what honor looked like, in real time, at 30,000 feet. In the days that followed, the impact of what happened at Gate D27 rippled through the corridors of Continental Skylines and beyond. Internally, the airline moved fast. A comprehensive review of boarding procedures was launched, focusing on how veterans and elderly passengers were flagged and supported. The Brennan Priority Protocol became more than a press release. It was implemented nationwide within 72 hours, complete with staff memos, training modules, and signage updates. Every gate agent received an urgent directive. Medal of Honor recipients and similarly decorated veterans were to be recognized, accommodated, and, most importantly, treated like the national treasures they are. Tina, the gate agent whose indifference had sparked the incident, was reassigned to administrative duties pending a full review. Her supervisor, who had approved the seating shuffle, was formally reprimanded and placed into a mandatory retraining program. In contrast, Mark, the junior agent who had remained quiet but visibly uncomfortable, was quietly commended by upper management for escalating concerns to his team leader shortly after the incident. The Hero Support Desk was expanded with increased staffing and clearer authority to override automated systems when needed. Veterans organizations across the country shared the story, not just to praise the airline's eventual response, but to spotlight how easily systems can fail people who've already given everything. Airline competitors took note, with some announcing plans to review their own veteran policies. What happened wasn't just about George Brennan. It became a national conversation about visibility, respect, and the silent failures built into everyday systems. The company, while initially shamed, earned back a measure of goodwill by responding swiftly and publicly. For many Americans watching from afar, it wasn't the apology that mattered most. It was the fact that someone powerful had stepped off the ivory tower into a gate terminal and said, "We got this wrong," and then actually fixed it. George Brennan arrived at the hotel just after dusk, the sky over D.C. streaked with amber and violet. The driver helped him out of the car, carrying his bag with the same quiet deference shown throughout the day. Inside his room, George sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. He didn't turn on the TV, though he sensed the story had gone far beyond Gate D27. His phone buzzed. His daughter. "Dad, I saw the video. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. He chuckled softly, easing into the armchair. "Just a bit of turbulence on the ground," he said. "Nothing serious." He didn't tell her about the sting of being dismissed or the humbling moment when a crowd of strangers chose to stand with him. Instead, he asked how her shift went. George had never done what he did for recognition. He wore the medal not as a badge of pride, but as a tribute to those who didn't make it home. But that day, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a burden, not as a forgotten name on a manifest, but as a man whose sacrifice mattered. That was more than any upgrade. It was a restoration. In a world that often runs on algorithms, upgrades, and loyalty tiers, it's easy to forget the people behind the boarding passes. What happened to George Brennan was more than a seating error. It was a reminder of how quickly respect can be lost in the shuffle of modern convenience, but it also showed how swiftly it can be restored when someone decides to do the right thing, not because it's policy, but because it's human. A quiet man, a phone call, and a moment of corporate courage turned a routine flight into a national reflection on dignity and gratitude. It shouldn't take a Medal of Honor or a viral video for someone to be treated with basic decency, but when it does, let that story serve as a guidepost. Because real honor isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention, but when it's acknowledged, it has the power to bring an entire system to a halt and set it on a better path. If you believe heroes like George Brennan deserve more than a middle seat, and that respect should never be a standby option, follow for more stories that matter. Subscribe to X Daily Stories, because some flights carry more than passengers. The airport was buzzing with the usual midweek rush, carry-ons clattering over tile, baristas shouting drink orders, boarding announcements echoing overhead. No one paid much attention to the older man seated near Gate D27, dressed in a plain cardigan and reading an old paperback. His name was Major George Brennan, 79, a retired Army field medic and Medal of Honor recipient, en route to Washington, D.C., for a White House ceremony honoring distinguished veterans. His daughter had scraped together enough frequent flyer miles and savings to book him a first-class ticket, Seat 1C, so he could travel in comfort despite his chronic injuries. But as he approached the gate counter with his ID and boarding pass, the agent barely glanced up before handing him a new ticket. "You've been moved to 34E, sir. Middle seat, economy," she said flatly. There was no explanation, no apology, just a quiet dismissal cloaked in the sterile language of airline policy. Major Brennan looked down at the flimsy new slip of paper, then back at the agent's averted gaze. And just like that, a man who had once dragged wounded comrades through gunfire was pushed to the back of the plane, forgotten in a crowd that had no idea who he was. George Brennan didn't look like a man who had once crawled through enemy fire with a shattered leg to save lives. At 79, he moved slowly, with the help of a cane and a quiet resolve that made him easy to overlook in a world obsessed with hustle and noise. His clothes were modest: clean slacks, a knit sweater, and a weathered Army-issued coat that still fit, though his frame had shrunk over the years. He never boasted about the medal tucked into his wallet or the scar that ran across his ribs from the day everything changed in Fallujah. That honor to him belonged more to the men he couldn't save than to himself. His daughter, a nurse at a VA hospital, had insisted he go to Washington for the ceremony, saying, "It's your turn to be honored, Dad." She'd worked extra shifts to cover the miles it took to get him that first-class ticket, not for luxury, but for his aching back and the dignity he never asked for. George didn't seek attention. He'd spent his life in the background, serving, sacrificing, staying silent. But this day, at this gate, in the middle of America's everyday chaos, he would finally be seen. Tina Mallory had been working gates for 8 years, long enough to perfect the voice that sounded polite, but meant nothing. She stood behind the podium at gate D27, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes locked on her monitor, navigating the chaos with mechanical detachment. To her, today was just another flight, another set of headaches, late connections, baggage complaints, seat swaps. When George Brennan approached and handed her his ID and boarding pass with a soft, "Good morning," she barely looked up. One scan and a frown later, she was tapping rapidly, already irritated by the red alert blinking on her screen. "You've been reassigned to 34E, she said flatly, sliding a new boarding pass across the counter. George, puzzled, quietly explained his situation. The ticket booked months ago, the back pain, the Medal of Honor ceremony. Tina didn't blink. "Sir, seating isn't guaranteed. It's in our policy," she said, voice calm but clipped. "You can contact customer service after the flight." To her, he wasn't a war hero. He was just another logistics hiccup in a system she didn't design. Behind her, the line was growing. Her fingers hovered, ready to scan the next passenger. Policy didn't have a face. Policy certainly didn't make exceptions. George took the new boarding pass and stepped aside, settling into a stiff plastic chair near the gate window. Around him, the airport moved like clockwork, families juggling snacks, business travelers tapping away at laptops, overhead screens blinking with delays and upgrades. His fingers curled around the boarding pass marked 34E, a middle seat in the very back of the plane, as if gripping it would help him understand how things had gone so sideways. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired in a way that lived deep in the bones. He'd lived through worse, far worse, but something about being quietly dismissed by a stranger half his age hit harder than expected. Maybe it was because his daughter had tried so hard to make this trip special. Maybe it was because being forgotten felt more painful than any wound. Then he remembered the small card tucked inside his wallet. His daughter had written it in blue ink. Bold letters, Hero Support Desk. Call this if anything goes wrong. She'd made him promise. He pulled out the card, stared at it for a long moment, then made the call. Hero Support, this is Aaron speaking. How can I help you? The voice on the other end said, calm and clear. George explained what had happened. No bitterness, just the facts. Major Brennan, Medal of Honor, first class downgraded to economy, flying to D.C. for a White House event. A pause, rapid typing. Then, thank you, sir. Please stay at your gate. Someone will be with you shortly. The call ended. George slipped the card back into his wallet and looked out at the runway. He wasn't sure what would happen, but at least someone had listened. For the next few minutes, George sat quietly, the boarding pass still resting in his palm like a bad joke. Around him, the gate agents called out group numbers, families shuffled into lines, and the usual travel buzz continued uninterrupted. If the phone call had meant anything, there was no sign of it. No gate announcement, no sudden rush of concern. Tina hadn't even glanced his way. He considered letting it go, just accepting the downgrade, squeezing into 34E, pretending it didn't matter. After all, he'd spent a lifetime putting others first. What was one more sacrifice? But a small ache deep in his lower back reminded him why his daughter had insisted on first class in the first place. More than comfort, it was about principle, about not being shuffled aside in silence. Still, the doubt crept in. Maybe he had expected too much. Maybe the hero support line was just another PR gimmick. A kind voice, some typing, a polite promise, and then nothing. He reached into his coat pocket, found a butterscotch candy he always kept for long flights, unwrapped it slowly. He could hear the gate agent announcing, Group 3 now. His group, the last to board. As he shifted in his seat, preparing to stand, the atmosphere at the terminal changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably. A sharp clatter of dress shoes against tile. 3 figures in suits, one with a headset, moving with purpose through the crowd. They weren't security. They weren't flight crew. They were heading straight for gate D27. George sat back down, confused, as people began to turn their heads, murmuring. A moment later, the man leading the group, a tall executive with silver hair and a name badge no gate agent had ever seen before, asked one question that cut through the entire concourse. Where is Major George Brennan? George blinked as the question echoed across the gate area. A few passengers glanced his way, but most still didn't know who he was or why that name meant anything. He stayed seated, unsure whether to raise his hand or simply wait. The tall man in the suit, clearly someone with authority, spoke urgently to the gate agent. Tina, suddenly pale, pointed a trembling finger toward George without saying a word. The executive nodded once and made his way over, flanked by 2 assistants. As they approached, George instinctively stood, straightening his posture despite the ache in his spine. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was this just protocol? A PR cover-up? Or had someone actually listened? A part of him remained skeptical. He'd seen too many situations in life where promises evaporated under pressure. But this felt different. There was something in the urgency of their pace, the anxiety in their expressions, that hinted at genuine accountability. The man extended his hand. Major Brennan, I'm Martin Krause, president of Continental Skylines. I came here the moment I was informed. Please accept my deepest apology. George was stunned into silence. This wasn't a scripted email or a delayed voucher. This was the CEO in person, sweat on his brow and remorse in his voice. People around them were starting to notice, whispers rippling as phones came out. But George was barely aware of it. He was stuck on one thought. Someone had seen him. Not just the medal or the history, but him. That small act, making the call, trusting someone would care, had triggered something massive. He didn't know whether to feel embarrassed or vindicated. He only knew the weight in his chest had lightened just a bit. And for the first time that morning, the seat in economy no longer felt like the only option. Krause's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed urgency as he leaned in toward George. Sir, I want to be crystal clear. What happened at this gate does not represent who we are or how we treat our heroes. The murmurs grew louder around them, passengers frozen in boarding lines, watching what felt like a scene from a movie. Phones were up now, some discreet, some blatantly recording. Krause turned to his assistant and gave a sharp nod. Within seconds, a flurry of motion followed. Another executive speaking rapidly into a headset, a flight attendant rushing from the jet bridge, and a man in uniform, possibly from airport security, gesturing for space. The boarding process halted entirely. Tina stood paralyzed at the gate desk, staring down at her monitor, cheeks flushed, hands trembling. George said nothing. He didn't have to.